Hey everyone, welcome. In this video we'll do a basic setup for a project that utilizes Sequelize and TypeScript together. And if you've tried to use TypeScript with Sequelize before and you found yourself frustrated, then you're not alone. Taking a look at the documentation at Sequelize.org, you can see that as far as TypeScript is concerned, the documentation is pretty sparse. They give you just one long example. And it says right at the top, as Sqlize heavily relies on runtime property assignments, TypeScript won't be very useful out of the box. So that's not very promising. Right? And if you don't have a lot of experience with either technology and you try to get moving quickly and you start copying and pasting this code into your project, you're likely to get pissed off in a hurry. But I'm confident that by the end of this video, which should be about 40 to 60 minutes, you'll feel a lot more comfortable using TypeScript and Sqlize together. And as a note, I'll be using a Postgres database for this video. You can use another database if you like. But before we go any further, go ahead and pause the video and get your database set up. Okay, so hopefully you've gotten your database set up. And now, if you have a folder ready to go, let's initialize it. Let's add our TypeScript dependencies. Of course, we'll need TypeScript. Since this is a node project, we'll need a package called types node. We'll need ts node. And rather than use nodemon to watch for file changes, I'm going to use ts node dev. It's a little faster in my experience. And these are all dev dependencies because we want to check for errors during development and not at runtime. Okay, and we'll likely use Express if we're going to add a server to our project, so we'll install Express. And we'll want to keep our connection string variable values a secret, so we'll add a .env file as well. For our Sqlize dependencies, we'll of course need Sequelize. And then if you go to the documentation page for Sequelize, getting started, tell you what else you'll need. For example, if you're using a Postgres database, you'll need these two dependencies. Now, PG is a dependency that has been used for a long time by people using Postgres in a node project. And then PG_HStore is just another thing we'll need to use along with Sequelize. If you're using another database, such as MySQL, then go ahead and add the necessary dependency. You can see they're all listed here. So I'm just going to grab these here. And if you're very new to TypeScript and you don't have TypeScript installed globally, go ahead and do that now, because if you do, then you can run a command tsc-init and that'll automatically generate a ts config file for you, which you'll need. Alright, so here it is. Let's go set the target to ES6. Let's allow JavaScript files for now. You probably know that TypeScript doesn't like it when you don't specify an output directory for your compiled JavaScript files. I call mine build. And then we can exclude node modules too. And since we're doing that, let's go ahead and add a Git Ignore file to our project. Probably won't be pushing my changes to GitHub, but it's always good to add one of these just in case. So for now, we'll exclude the node modules and the .env file. Let's add a .env file. And then you'll need some variables for your connection string. I'm going to go with db user, db name, and db pass. All right, and then I'll go ahead and enter in my values for my connection, and you can do the same. I'll pause the video. Okay, so we got those values entered in. And to bootstrap our project, I'm going to use the Sqlize CLI tool, and that'll generate some files and folders, or folders and files for us that make it so that we can write less code and get up and running more quickly. So go ahead and install that. So Sqlize CLI. And if you take a look at the documentation, it's under migrations. They've got some information about it here. So you can see that it's a dev dependency. All right, and then you can use it to initialize your project. So once that's installed, you can run not npm but npx Sequelize CLI init. And it tells you that it's generated some folders for you. First it generated this, well, I don't know if it did it first, but it generated this config folder which has a config.json file in it. If we take a look at it, it has our connection set up for development, testing, and production. Of course, in this video we're only going to deal with development. You can directly put in your connection values here, but since we want to keep ours a secret, we're going to use .env. And to do that, we can't leave it as a .json file, so we'll go ahead and switch this over and make it a JavaScript file. And we'll have to export it. Alright, so we'll need to, it seems like we've got an error in our tsconfig file. Let's take a look at that. Okay, well. It says module common.js. That's never seemed to be a problem before. Let me go ahead and pause the video while I figure this out. Okay, I see what I did. I meant to let's go ahead. I didn't mean to specify output file, but the output directory. So let me just, all right, there we go. So it's the output directory that we want to be billed. All right, so that looks good. So going back to our config.js file, we'll be using .env here. So for the username, right, that would be process.env, and then for me that was db user. Let's go ahead and copy this. Minus db pass. This was db name. Now I don't mind exposing the name of the database, but the password and maybe the username will just keep it secret, just to keep as much, well, of course the password, but the username as well, just to keep as much information secret as possible. I'm using a Postgres database, so change the dialect value to Postgres. Right, and since we're using .env, we'll have to require it here. And we can test it to make sure that it's properly importing the values. So we'll do that with db name, since I don't mind sharing that. And so we can run this file with node config/config. Right, and we see that the variable value was imported properly, so that's good. Go ahead and get rid of this. Now, this is being used in another file, and that is inside of the models folder. Right, this index.js file. Now, what this file does is it allows you to use, it basically makes your database connection, Sqlize, and your models available throughout your project just by importing the file. But you see here, it's looking for config.json, but we changed it to JS, so we can do that. Right, and if you're wondering about whether that's legal or not, you can just take a look at the documentation. And that's under migrations again. So if you go down to dynamic configuration, it says the configuration file is by default a JSON file, but sometimes you need a dynamic configuration, so you can, long story short, use both JSON and JS files. All right, and they show you that here. Okay, and since this this index.js file is inside of the models folder, it opens up, or it looks at all of the other files in that directory, the models directory, and it says if they have a file extension of JavaScript, then it will go ahead and return them. But we don't want those to be JS, we want them to be TS, right? Because we're going to make them TypeScript files. Right, and then for each file that's found with that extension, each file will represent a specific model, like a user model or a project model. It'll go ahead and inject the Sqlize package and also data types into it, so it'll be available for use inside of your model class. I know that's a lot of talking, so we'll try to move on from just too much explaining and just get on to the doing. Also, it looks at your associations and handles those as well, and you'll see what I mean by association in a minute. Looking at the other folders that the Sqlize CLI has added for us by running the init command, it's added this migrations folder. And if you're going to use Sqlize in production, you'll want to use migrations. That way you can keep track of changes to the database. But we're not going to use that for this for this video. And then you've got a seeders folder here, but don't delete it yet. We might just use it to store some files later. All right, so now let's check our database connection. So in the root of our project, let's add a file, and we'll call that index.ts. And we'll just set up a simple Express server. And you can see that TypeScript doesn't like this. It says that Express is declared, but its value is never read. But it also shows you how to solve the problem just by importing @type/express, which you're going to see that we have to add a lot of packages that begin with @types just to make sure that our packages work with TypeScript. Right, but it also allows you just to click this quick fix. And that's not what we want to do. So never mind that. Go ahead and hover again. Grab this part here. copy it, and then add it. And once it's added, you can see that the error will go away. And it does. All right, and then we'll want to bring in our database connection. And that's located in the index.js file in our models folder. So we can just do this. Since it's index.js, it's considered the default file in the models folder, so we can just go this far in defining our path, and it knows to grab that index.js file. All right, so if we have some models defined, which we don't yet, but if we do, and the index.js file picks those up, there's a function we can run. It's model.sync, and what that'll do is it'll look for a table in the database that corresponds to that model, and if it doesn't find it, it'll add it automatically. So you can see by looking at the documentation under model basics, if you go down to model synchronization, you can see that that's what it does. It says right here, user.sync, and that's for a user model. It creates a table if it doesn't exist and does nothing if it already exists. So if you wanted to create tables for all of your models, you can use Sequelize.sync right here. All right, so we're going to use that. And then we'll want to run our Express server. All right, and to run this file, let's go ahead and go to our package Json file and add a script. We'll just call it dev. And remember, we're going to use ts node dev. So if you go to the documentation for that, it tells you just to use this right here as your run command. But we're not using a file called server.ts, we're using one called index.ts. Alright, so let's go ahead and try to run our server and run Sequelize.sync as well. Okay, good. So we know that we're connected because it ran this little test SQL query. Also, we know that our Express server is running. All right, good. So now what we'll want to do is we'll want to set up our models. All right, we don't have any models set up, so we don't have any tables in our database. It didn't do anything for us when we ran Sequelize.sync. You can take a look at my database setup in pgadmin. So I've got this database called ts_Sequelize, and I've got no tables. So I'm going to create models now to, well, they will eventually be used by Sequelize.sync to create the tables. So we can, actually, let me go back to the documentation. We can generate those models using the Sqlize CLI. So if you go to the migration section again, you've got the command right here. It's another npx command. So if you copy that, and this is under creating the first model and migration, paste it in, and then we'll change. We're going to create a user model, so that can stay the same, but attributes, for now, just add a single attribute. We don't need to add them all right now, but you need to add at least one, otherwise it won't work. So we'll add an attribute name, and that will be a string. Alright, so it tells us that it added a model and a migration, but we're not concerned with migrations in this video, so just go right to your models folder and you can see that there is a model called user. And the file name is user.js. Alright, so you can see that it brings in the model from Sqlize. Right. Also, it brings in these two values, and if you're wondering where they come from, they're brought in from index.js. Right. It goes to each file, and then it requires the file and injects the parameter values here. Right. And then it defines a class called user, which extends the model class. And then it gave us our only attribute that we specified, which is name, but we're going to add a lot more. But for now, you see this is a JavaScript file. We want it to be TypeScript. So first, go ahead and make this a TypeScript file. All right, and you'll see right off the bat you get a few errors. Now we have Sequelize, data types, and models. They all have the same error. Right, it says Sqlize implicitly has an any type. And you'll find a lot of times when you look online and you want to know when it's okay to use any as a type, you'll see many people be very vocal about not using any as a type at all and not being lazy. But in this case, and you can take a look at the TypeScript documentation, says here about using the any type. It says in some situations not all type information is available or its declaration would take an inappropriate amount of effort. Now the part about an inappropriate amount of effort, you should probably ignore that as much as possible, because if you start thinking everything is an inappropriate amount of effort, you'll never really properly do type checking. But it says here that these situations may occur for values from a third-party library, right? And that's what we're using, Sequelize, as a third-party library, and we're going to trust that library. If we didn't trust it, we wouldn't use it. So in that case, we're going to be okay just using the any type here. So go ahead and do that. All right. So since we're using ES6, let's go ahead and use an import statement. All right, and if you go to the documentation for Sequelize regarding TypeScript, you can see they tell you, and if you've used TypeScript before, this will be familiar to you, to set up an interface. And since our model is user, we'll call the interface user attributes. All right, but our ID, we're going to use UUID, which is a string. The name will be a string, that's okay. We're going to have an email. And also a password. All right, and we'll want to use this. So if you look at the documentation, and I'm just showing you the documentation so that you feel more comfortable and not just trusting every single thing I say and do. can see here that we'll use the user attributes, right? So add that here. And then we'll want to implement user attributes. Right, but once we do that, then TypeScript complains. It says that we have incorrectly implemented the interface user attributes. So let's rectify that. Go down here and specify our properties. One is ID, and we're going to make that non-nullable. It's required, right? And that's going to be a string. Also a name, which will be non-nullable. Also a string. An email address, non-nullable and also a string, and then a password, of course, non-nullable and also a string. Alright, so we're no longer getting that error. Alright, and then down here, we only specified one attribute, and that was the name for the user model, but we need more. We need 4 in total. So first we'll add in the ID, and you can see that TypeScript is not happy about something, but once we do most of the work in adding these fields in, it's going to let up on us a little bit. So go ahead and add in ID, type, data types, and that will be UUID. Right, this is non-nullable, so you use allow null as false. It's going to be a primary key. Set that to true. And also, we'll set the default value here to UUID v4. And so next we have our name. Type data types dot string allow null false. Next is our email. Of course, it's non-nullable as well. And we also want to make it so that no two users can register with the same email address, right? So we'll set a field called unique to true, right? And then Sqlize will take care of that check for us, so we don't have to do it ourselves later. Then finally, we'll need our password, and you can see that TypeScript is finally let up on us. Alright, so this file is mostly completed. Now, here's the association we were talking about earlier, right? That gets handled here in the index.js file. So we're going to have two models for this setup, for this basic setup. Imagine we're creating a project management tool, and we're going to have a user model, and we're going to have a project model. And a user can be a member of several projects, and a project can have several users attached to it, right? So that means we have a many-to-many relationship. So in that case, we'll use, with Sequelize, the belongs to many function. So we'll have user dot belongs to many. All right, and it belongs to many. We have to use models to bring in project. And that's through a junction table we're going to call project assignments. So basically, with this junction table, we'll add a user ID and a project ID to associate a user to a project, right? And we're setting that up here. Okay, so that's all there is for this model. All right, so we'll do the same thing for the project model. So we'll use that generator that Sqlize CLI has for us. And we're not using user anymore. It's project, attributes, and we'll, instead of calling it a project name, we'll call it a project title, and that'll be a string. We're going to have other attributes as well, but we just want to get it generated. We'll add those later. So again, it says it created a new model for us, and we see that in our models folder we have a project model. It's a project.js file. So first, let's go ahead and change that to TypeScript. And we see those 3 errors that we got last time. So we'll set the type to any for each. Okay, and just like before, we set up some user attributes. This time we'll set up an interface and we'll call it project attributes. And the ID won't be UUID. This time we'll use an integer, but in JavaScript it's just number. The title is a string. And the project will have a status field. So that would be, for example, completed, active, meaning not completed, on hiatus, whatever you want to use. And also, let's be consistent here and use an import statement. Right, let's implement this in our class. Right, again we get this error, so let's add those fields that we need to add. ID is required, that's a number. Title required, that's a string. And status required, also a string. All right, and our first field was ID. That's an integer. It's non-nullable. It's required. It's a primary key. And we want to step up the project ID number each time we add a new project. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll use auto increment set to true. Right, next we have title. And status. Okay, don't forget to add all the commas you need to add. All right, and the association looks just like the other one. It's now we're just going in the other direction. We're associating a excuse me, we're associating a user with or a bunch of users with a project. We could say here project dot belongs to many. In this case, models dot user. And that's through the junction table, same junction table, project assignments. Okay, so even though we don't have a model for project assignment, when we run Sequelize.sync and it creates our two tables for us, because we've defined this association here and here, right, that means that we'll get that table, project assignments, created for us automatically. So let's try that. All right, is there anything we want to do before we do that? Well, first, since these two these two models here have TypeScript file extensions, they're TypeScript files, let's also make index.js a TypeScript file. So rename that index.ts. And you see here you get 9 errors. All right. Now, first off, it really doesn't know what to do with this database right here. All right, so if we make this any, things will work out a little bit better for us. And we can do that because we're trusting Sequelize. So if you make this any, it makes these errors down here go away. All right, now Sqlize, if you just hover over it, it says it implicitly has type any. We could do that, or we could just go to quick fix, infer the type of Sqlize from its usage, and it turns out to be any. All right, that means that TypeScript couldn't really figure out what to do with it either. For file here, we can do the same thing, quick fix, infer parameter types from usage, turns out to be a string, and then here, same thing, turns out to be any. And then we have one more error in this file, or actually not in this file, in our index.ts. All right, so our export is somehow screwed up. It doesn't like this. So because it's not a module anymore, right? Because we've got the any type, it really doesn't know what to do with it. So if we go back to this file, and rather than using module.exports, we can just use export default db. And we no longer have that problem here. Okay, so we should be able to run our dev command and see a couple of tables added to the database. All right, so let's do that. Okay, so you can see here that it says create table if not exists projects. All right, so it used our project model and it created a table called projects, right? It takes your model and it pluralizes it for the table name. It did the same thing for the user model, create table if not exists users, right? But if you look down here, it also said create table if not exists project assignments. So that tells us it created a table called project assignments even though we never defined the model, just because we implicitly defined it through our associations. So let's take a look at our database just to see how things are, or how they look. So refresh tables. Now you can see I've got 3 tables, so let's take a look at users. All right, so as we specified, there's an ID, which is a UUID. It has a name as a string, email as a string, password as a string. It also automatically includes created at and updated at timestamps. All right, if we look at projects, so we've got project ID as an integer, that's the primary key. It's got a title as a string, status as a string, created at, updated at. Going back to users, you can see also that our user ID was a primary key. And then the project assignments table, which it created for us because we specified those associations. It said there's a project ID and a user ID value. and it made both of those primary keys for us. And it made it basically a composite primary key, so that if both of these values are repeated, then we won't be able to add a value to the table, right? It would be like trying to assign the same project, or trying to assign a project to the same user twice. We don't want that to happen. All right, good. So now what we'll want to do is go ahead and add some values to the database so that we can run a query just to make sure everything's working okay. So go back to your code. So in your seeders folder, and let's go ahead and stop the web server. Well, you can leave it running, it's fine. But in your seeders folder, add a file called users.ts. Actually, no, let's just make it that. Okay, so we'll just add two users for now. So we'll have a user that has an ID created by UUID, right? So we need that package, right? We don't have it installed yet. We didn't install it, right? Good. So we'll stop your dev server now and install UUID. Right, and its usage is found at its home page. Right, you want to grab this import statement right here using ES6 syntax. All right, now you can probably guess that because TypeScript gave us an error here, it's going to want a corresponding types package. And you can see that it does, right? And that's this package right here. Let's see if we can get it to add it just by clicking Quick Fix, install types UUID, wait for the error to go away. It does, so we can take a look at our package JSON file and see that it added that package for us. So TypeScript being very helpful. All right, so the ID will just be UUID4, name will be Octavio Flores, email password. All right, and we'll have another person who is a member of the same company. We'll generate the ID in the same way, of course. Okay, so we have two users here. And let's see if we can't add them to the database. So we'll need to import from this file to our index.ts. Let's close this out just because we're going to get confused, or at least I am. Okay, that should be users. Good. All right, so what we'll need to do is use a Sqlize function called create. So let's define a function first called create users. And we'll map over the users list that we're importing. We'll need that user model. So it'll be model.create, and then we'll just create a user for each user. And you can see the user type just by hovering over it. You can see the properties that are associated with it. All right, and those are brought in from the other file. So let's go ahead and make a function call here. And run the dev server. Okay, so you can see that it tried to create tables again, but it's not going to because those tables already exist. And then it's doing an insert function, right? So it's adding users to the database. And if we go to our database and we check, so users, refresh. All right, we can see we've got 2 users in there. That's good. All right, so now let's add some projects. So in your seeders folder, add a file called projects.ts. So you don't have to worry about specifying the ID here. It's going to be done automatically since we set auto increment to true. So we can just set a title. And we'll call the first project site upgrade login page. And then we'll give it a status of active. And we'll create 3 projects. We want to assign 2 projects to a single person. I'll say here user dashboard. And that'll be active as well. And then the last one will say database maintenance. Let this one be completed. All right, so we'll do the same thing in our index.ts file. Let's go ahead and change this not to create users, but to create projects. We'll need to import that projects list. Okay, and we'll map over that list of projects. And we're no longer using the user model, but the project model. All right, so let's change our function call as well. And see if we can add those projects. Okay, so we can see that it inserted into projects 3 different projects. Good, so let's take a look at our database. So go to Projects, View, Edit Data, and we've got those 3 projects. All right, but we don't have any way right now of assigning projects to users or users to projects, so we'll need to create a model for the project assignments table. Right, it already created the table for us, but we need a model so that we can use these functions like create and find all. All right, so stop your dev server. All right, find that model creation, or that model generator command. All right, and the name of this model is going to be project assignment. Right, and we'll give it a single attribute for now. And if you look at the project assignments table, you can see how it named the columns, right? So it's got project ID, right, where the leading P is uppercase and I is also uppercase. So don't forget to use that when you're specifying your project assignment model, or when you're defining your project assignment model. And what happened to our command? That's weird. Somehow we lost that bit of code. Just want to make sure that it didn't insert that project into, or it didn't create that file. It didn't. Okay, so sorry, just talking to myself here. You probably are okay with everything that's going on. So again, we'll name it project assignment. Spell it correctly. Attributes, and we'll say project ID, and that'll be an integer. Alright, so it says it generated a model for us. Let's go in and do the usual thing. Make it a TypeScript file first. Alright, fix our errors. Use an import statement. Need to define an interface. Of project assignment attributes. So it will have a project ID, and that will be an integer. Right, so in JavaScript we'll just say number. It'll also have a user ID, which is UUID, but in this case we'll specify it as a string. We're not going to define an association because we already have an association between users and projects. Sorry, we'll just finish up down here. Actually, I already defined it here. So what am I doing? Specified the attribute when we generated the model. What else do we need here? We need to define the foreign key. So that should be references, model, and that will be the name of the table, which would be projects. Sorry, it's key ID. Right, and then we'll define the user ID as well. It's going to be very similar. Okay, so that should be good. It should allow us now to add some project assignments to the project assignments table. So go into your Cedars folder and create a new file called project assignments. It's a TypeScript file. Alright, so we'll need first a project ID, and then we'll need a user ID. Alright, now we can get these, because we're going to need to use values that have already been established, right? We don't want to make up new users and projects on the fly. We want to add existing users to existing projects. So if you go to your database, and get the ID for Octavio. Let's just copy that and put that here under user ID. And we'll attach him to project 1. Right, we'll also attach him to project 2. Let's make it 3. Alright, and then the other person, the other user we have, Farah, we'll get her ID, and we'll add her to project 1 along with Octavio. Okay, so we should be able to add these 3 assignments. So go to your index.ts file. Right, and then we'll change this function. Not using the best naming for this project, but oh well. Alright, and the model is project assignment. Okay, so hopefully we can add these assignments to our database. It doesn't look like we have any errors. It said it inserted into project assignments those 3 assignments. So let's check our database out. Go to project assignments. And good. We were able to add those. Now one thing we can do is we could try to add, just as a test, we can try to assign a project to the same person twice and see if we can do that or get an error. We should get an error, right? Because we set a composite primary key saying that if both of these are true, if the user ID and the project ID being used together have already been used together in another assignment, then we shouldn't be able to create a new assignment. So going back to your code, let's just copy or comment this out. Before we do anything, let's just stop our dev server. We don't want it getting ahead of us. And we'll add from here. So just try to add this one again. This one's already been added. So we put that in here. It should throw an error, and that would be good. Okay, good. You can see here that there's a Sqlize unique constraint error, right? That means there should be only one project assigned to a person one time. We shouldn't be able to assign the same project several times. All right, and that's good. So it's working, so we're not able to do that. Okay, so now to see the power of Sequelize, you can take a look at what gets returned if you look up all the users. Now, if I were using just regular SQL queries, I might have to use 2 inner joins to actually get all of the information about a user I need, which would include not only their name, their email, and ID, but also a list of projects they belong to. But what we can do to find all that information in one lookup is this. So we can use the find all function. We want to include, did not want to do that. All right, let me make sure I'm not putting it in the wrong way. So let's go ahead and take a look at the go under associations. All right, well, you can see right here, this is what we're going to use. So going back to our code, our model will be db.project. So we want to find all the associated projects. Right, and let's run that and see what we get back. Actually, we won't see anything unless we log it to the console, so we'll do that. All right, now TypeScript is demanding that we specify a type. Or actually, no. What I needed to do is put an arrow here. Now it's demanding that I specify a type. Right, and this result is going to be an object, right? So what we can do is wrap that with a set of parentheses and specify object. Okay, and then if we get an error, we can log that to the console. And we'll set this also as an object. All right, but then again, we're getting this from Sqlize. You could just as easily set it to any. It's not a problem. We're trusting Sqlize. So go ahead and run npm run dev. Looks like we got an error here. And so we don't need these. See if that. Okay, here we go. So you can see here we've got a big response. All right, and if it's hard to read here, we could just send it to localhost 3000 if we like. What we could do is say app.get of this, put it in here. And rather than logging it to the console, okay, so if we go to port 3000, all right, we can see that. So here's our response, right? So it gave us a user, the user's ID, their name, their email. Unfortunately, we returned the password. We didn't want to return that. You'll have to think of a way to exclude that information when you make your queries. Gave us last updated, when it was created. It also gave us that list of projects, right? So we didn't have to do that double inner join thing that we would normally have to do. It did it for us. So that's nice. In one call, we can get all of that information. So for Octavia, we get his 2 projects. And we also get his project assignments. Right, so we got everything. And you can filter it and get just as much or as little information as you need. All right, so that's it. That's getting set up with TypeScript using Sequelize. It took a little bit longer than an hour. It's a little bit longer than I'd promised, but I hope that at this point now you've got a pretty good idea about how to get yourself up and running with TypeScript and Sqlize. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comment section below the video. And as always, thank you, and I'll see you next time.